Welcome back to Unshakable Promises. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Sproul. Today, we're stepping back into a topic that almost everyone wrestles with at some point in their life, and that is timing. Not just any timing, but the tension between your timing and God's timing. This is where a lot of frustration, confusion, and even doubt begins to show up. This is something in all of us that want things to happen now. When you set a goal, you want to see progress quickly. When you're working towards something important, you want results. When you're praying for change, you want answers. That desire for movement is natural. It makes sense. But the challenge comes when things do not happen as we expect. You may ask yourself that question is why is things taking so long? Or what am I doing wrong? Or even is God even hearing me? Those questions are real and they are more common than people admit. Waiting can feel uncomfortable. It can feel uncertain. It can feel like nothing is happening at all. But what if something is happening? That is the shift we're going to talk about today. The Bible is filled with examples of people who had to wait. Abraham waited for years for the promise of his son. Joseph went through seasons of hardship before stepping into his purpose. David was anointed as king long before he actually became king. In these situations, there was a gap between the promise and the fulfillment. The gap is where most people struggle. I admit, I struggle here too. It is easy to trust when things are moving. It's harder to trust when things feel still. When you cannot see progress, it can feel like you're stuck. But just because something feels still does not mean nothing's happening. God's timing is not random. It's intentional. It's not rushed. It's purposeful. 2 Peter 3:8 reminds us that with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. That verse gives us perspective. It reminds us that God does not operate on the same timeline as we do. We tend to focus on immediate results. God focuses on long-term transformation. That difference matters. Sometimes the delay you're experiencing is not something that's being held back. It is about being prepared. It is about growth that needs to happen before the next step. It's about alignment, clarity, and readiness. If things move at your pace all the time, you might step into situations you're not fully prepared to deal with. That's where trust comes in. Trust is not about understanding everything. It's about believing that there is purpose even when you cannot see it clearly. In this episode, we're going to break this down in a way that's simple and practical. We're going to talk about why waiting feels so difficult, what God may be doing during those seasons, and how you stay grounded when things feel delayed, and how to shift that mindset so waiting does not feel like wasted time. If you ever felt frustrated with how long something's taking, if you ever question whether things are moving in the right direction, or even if you're currently in this waiting season where nothing is changing, this episode's for you. It's for me too, right? The goal today is not to rush through the process. The goal is helping you understand so that even when you're moving forward, you're moving with clarity, with confidence, and less frustration. Because when you understand the process, waiting begins to feel different. And waiting is one of the hardest things people have to deal with, especially when it comes to something that matters deeply to them. It's not just about time, it's about uncertainty. It's about not just knowing when something will change, how it will change, or even when it's going to happen, what you need to expect. That lack of clarity is what makes waiting so uncomfortable. Part of the challenge comes from how we're wired. We are used to seeing results quickly. In many areas of life, you put effort and expect to see progress, right? You work, you get paid. You study, you improve. You make the decisions and you see the outcome. That pattern creates expectations and that effort leads to immediate results. But when it comes to God's timing, that pattern does not always apply, right? You can be doing things right and feel like nothing's happening. You can be consistent, disciplined, focused, and still feel like you're in the same place. That disconnect between effort and visible results is where frustration begins. Another reason waiting feels difficult is because it challenges our control. Most people like to feel they are moving forward. They like to feel like they have influence over the situation. Waiting removes that sense of control. It forces you into a position where you have to trust instead of manage. That's not easy. When you cannot control the outcome, your mind begins to fill in the gaps, right? You start overthinking. You start asking questions. You start creating assumptions. Sometimes those assumptions are not helpful. They can lead to doubt, overthinking, and even discouragement. For example, you might start thinking you're doing something wrong, or that you missed an opportunity, or that things aren't going to work out. Those thoughts can build quickly if they're not checked. That's where perspective becomes important, right? Waiting is not the same as being stuck. It may feel similar, but they are not the same. Being stuck means there's no movement at all. Waiting means something is still in progress, even if you cannot see it clearly. That's a big difference. Isaiah 40:31 says, "For those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength." So that verse does not describe waiting as something passive or empty. It describes it as something that actually builds strength. That means there is a purpose behind it. Another reason waiting feels difficult is because it exposes impatience in us. It reveals how much we rely on immediate results to feel secure. When those results are not there, it can create discomfort. But that discomfort can also lead to growth. Waiting teaches patience, but more importantly, it teaches trust. It teaches how you stay steady when things are unclear. It teaches you how to keep moving forward when needing constant reassurance. There's also the emotional side of waiting. When something matters to you, the delay feels personal. It's not just about time passing, it's about something you care more about not happening yet. The emotional connection can make waiting feel even heavier. You may feel discouraged. You may feel tired. You may even feel like giving up at all different times. That's normal, but those moments do not define the outcome. Another thing to recognize is that waiting often shifts your focus. Instead of focusing on what you're doing right now, you begin to focus on what's not happening yet. That shift creates frustration because your attention is constantly on the future instead of the present. When your focus stays on what's not happening, it becomes harder to see what is happening. And something is always happening. Growth is happening. Preparation is happening. Clarity is developing. Even if it's not obvious, progress is still taking place. Waiting also tests consistency. It's easy to stay motivated when you see results. It's harder to stay consistent when you do not. That's where discipline becomes important. It's where foundation's tested. A good example of this is weight loss, right? Or working out and you're not seeing muscles get defined. You're working out, you're not losing weight, you may be gaining weight. But it's one of those things. Stay eating healthy, stay consistent, stay going to the gym, stay walking, right? Get on that right path. And long term, you see those goals. So are you going to keep showing up even when you do not see immediate results? That's a big question we ask ourselves. That is the question waiting asks. And how you answer that question shapes your growth, right? Do you give up? Do you stop going to the gym? Do you stop eating healthy because you don't see immediate results, right? Well, what do you see out there? You see examples of this. Waiting is not comfortable, but it's not meaningless either. It's part of the process. It's part of how you develop strength, patience, and trust. When you begin to understand that, waiting starts to feel different. It does not feel easy, but it starts to feel purposeful. And that shift changes how you move forward, right? One of the biggest questions people ask during this session is, what is actually happening right now? When you cannot see progress, it's easy to assume that nothing is moving. And the reality is, just because you cannot see it does not mean it's not happening. In many cases, the most important work is happening beneath the surface. So think about how growth works in the areas of your life. When something is being built, the foundation comes first, right? That part is not always visible and it often takes time. But without it, everything else becomes unstable. The same idea applies here. God often uses seasons of waiting to build something in you before he builds something through you. That shifts the perspective of matters. Instead of asking why nothing's happening, you begin to ask what is being developed. One of the primary things that being developed during waiting is character. Character is not formed when everything is easy. It is formed in moments where you feel uncertain, where you have to choose how you respond, and where you decide whether you're going to stay consistent. James 1:3 talks about how testing of your faith produces perseverance. That means the pressure you feel is not pointless. It is producing something. It is strengthening something that will support you later. Another thing that's often be developed is patience, right? Patience is not just about waiting quietly. It's about learning how to stay steady without needing immediate results. It's about being able to trust even when you do not have all the answers. This is not easy, but it's necessary. If everything happened instantly, there would be no time for growth. There would be no time to develop the ability to handle what comes next. Sometimes the delay is not being held back. It's about being prepared. Preparation is a key part of this process. There are situations in life where you feel you stepped into them too early and you were not ready for it. You might have a desire, but not the structure. You might have the opportunity, but not the stability. God sees that full picture, not just the movement you're in. That's why timing matters. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says there is time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. That means there is a right time. not just a possible time. And that right time includes both the opportunity and the readiness. So during waiting, alignment is also taking place. Things are being positioned in a way that you're not aware of. People, opportunities, circumstances are all being arranged. You may not see it yet, but that does not mean it's not happening. Another important part of waiting is clarity. When things slow down, you have the opportunity to think more clearly. You can evaluate your direction, your priorities, and your focus. You can make adjustments that you may not have noticed in everything because it's moving so quickly. Clarity helps you move forward with intention instead of reacting. This is also about strengthening that happens during the waiting. When you continue to show up, even when you do not see results, you're building discipline. You're building consistency. You're proving to yourself that you could keep going without needing constant reinforcement. That kind of strength carries into everything else you do. Waiting also deepens your dependence on God. When things are moving quickly, it's easy to rely on yourself. When things slow down, you begin to recognize your need for guidance, for patience, for trust. That dependence is not weakness, it's alignment. Another important part of waiting often reveals what matters most. When you're not distracted by constant movement, you begin to see your priorities more clearly. You begin to recognize what is important and what is not important. That helps you stay focused. It's also recognizing that growth during waiting is not always comfortable. There will be moments where you feel stretched, moments where you feel uncertain, moments where you question whether you are moving in the right direction. But those moments are part of the process. They are not signs that something's wrong. They are signs that something is developing. If you look back on times in your life where you experienced the most growth, it was likely during a season where you felt uncertain. It was not when everything was easy. It was when you had to stay consistent without clear results. That's where growth happens. God's timing is not about delay for the sake of delay. It's about development. It's about preparing you for what is ahead. So instead of asking why it's taken so long, consider asking what is being built right now. That question shifts our focus, right? It moves you from frustration to understanding. And when you understand that something is happening, even if you cannot see it, waiting begins to feel less like being stuck and more like being prepared. So understanding that God is doing something during that waiting system is one thing, right? Actually trusting that process while you're in it is something completely different. That is what most people struggle. It is easy to agree with the idea of trusting God's timing, but it becomes much harder when you're living through a season where nothing's happening and nothing's changing. Trust is not built based on theory. It's built on real time and real situation when things feel uncertain. One of the first things to recognize is that trust does not mean you always feel confident. There'll be moments when you feel unsure. There'll be moments and times where you question what is happening. That does not mean you're failing. It means you are human. Trust is not the absence of questions. It's the decision to keep moving forward even when you do not have all the answers. Proverbs 3:5 reminds us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and not lean on your own understanding. So that is a simple statement, but it's not easy to live out. Leaning on your own understanding feels natural because it gives you sense of control. But when things do not make sense, that approach starts to break down. Trust requires you to release the need to have everything figured out. Another important part of trusting the process is staying focused on what you can control. You cannot control timing, cannot control outcomes. You cannot control external circumstances, but you can control consistency, your effort, and your mind state. When you focus on that control, you reduce unnecessary frustration. Instead of constantly thinking of what's not happening, you focus on what you are doing right now. This keeps us grounded. Another key element is managing expectations. One of the seasons waiting feels so difficult is because expectations often tied to specific timelines. You expect something to happen within a certain period, and when it does not, it creates disappointment. When you feel the release of rigid timelines, you create that space of trust. That does not mean you stop having goals. It means you stop attaching your specific piece to a specific timeline. Philippians 4:6 talks about not being anxious, but instead bringing everything to God through prayer. That verse is a reminder that when anxiety starts to build, it's often connected to uncertainty about our future. Bringing that to God helps you release some of that pressure. Another way to trust a process is to stay present in today's time. When you're constantly focused on the future, it becomes easy to miss what's happening right now. You begin to overlook growth, opportunities, and progress because your attention is always on what has not happened yet. Being present helps you recognize that progress is still taking place, even if it's not the way you expected. It also helps to reduce overthinking. When your mind is constantly jumping ahead, it creates scenarios that may have not happened, that may never happen. Staying persistent helps you stay grounded in reality instead of getting pulled into assumptions. Consistency is another important part of that trust. Trust is not something you declare once and then move on. It is something you practice daily. It shows up in small decisions. It shows up in how you respond to frustration. It shows up whether you continue to even show, even if you're not getting results. Got to keep showing up. No results. I still got to stay moving forward. Those small actions build confidence over time. Another important piece is gratitude. Gratitude shifts that focus. Instead of only seeing what is missing, you begin to recognize what you already have and what's already there. This does not ignore challenges. It simply creates balance on how you see your situation. When you practice gratitude, it becomes easier to stay grounded. It is also important to recognize that trusting the process does not mean doing nothing. You're still responsible for showing up, putting in effort, and staying consistent. Trust and action work together. You trust the timing, but you stay active in growth. There will be moments where you feel tired of waiting, moments where you feel like nothing is changing, moments where you question whether it's worth continuing. Those moments are part of the process. What matters is how you respond to them. Do you stop or do you keep moving forward? Trust is built in those moments. Over time, as you continue to stay consistent, your perspective will begin to shift. You'll become less focused on how long something is taking and more focused on how to keep growing through it. And that shift changes everything. Waiting no longer feels like wasted time. It begins to feel like preparation, right? Change that mindset. When you see it that way, it becomes easier to trust the process. As we bring this episode together, the focus shifts from understanding to living. It is one thing to understand God's timing. It's another thing to live at peace in the middle of all this waiting. This is where everything we talked about begins to come together in a practical way. Living with peace during a waiting season does not mean everything feels perfect. It does not mean you never get frustrated or uncertain, right? It means you are not controlled by those feelings. It means you are able to stay grounded when things are not moving as you expected. One of the most important things to understand is that peace is not tied to circumstances. If your peace is based on things happening when you want, when you feel like they should be happening, that makes you feel a certain way, that's instability. But when your peace is rooted in trust, it becomes steady. John 14:27 talks about peace that is not like what the world gives. That means it's not dependent on external outcomes. It is something that remains even when situations are still unfolding. That is the kind of peace you want to build. Another important part of living with peace is learning how to manage your focus. What you focus on is how it shapes how you feel. If your attention is constantly on what has not happened yet, it's going to create frustration. You're going to be frustrated all the time. But when you shift your focus on what's happening right now, it creates that different perspective. This is where something's happening, right? Growth is happening. Strength is being built. Clarity is developing. Even if it's not obvious, progress is still taking place. Remember that. When you begin to recognize it, it becomes easier and even more steady. Another key part in letting go of that comparison. One of the fastest ways to lose peace is to look at someone else's timeline and measure it against your own, right? It creates pressure that's not necessary. It makes you feel like you are behind when you're actually where you need to be. Remember, everyone runs their own race. We cannot compare ourselves to one another. Just like, again, like we say on the natural side, one supplement may work for one, may not work for another. One nutrition plan may work for one, may not work for another. One person's timeline and how they run and their race they're running does not always work for us. We run our own race. We're individualized. We're all different. Everyone's processes are different. God's timing for your life is not going to look exactly like someone else's. When you accept that, it removes a lot of unnecessary frustration. It's also important to recognize that waiting does not mean you're being overlooked. It does not mean you're being forgotten. It does not mean you're not moving forward. It means you're in the process. Psalm 27:14 says, "To wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart." So that verse does not describe waiting as something passive. It describes it as something that requires strength. That means there is purpose in it. Living with peace also requires you to stay connected. When you stay connected to Scripture, to prayer, and to your faith, it becomes easier to stay grounded. When you disconnect, it becomes easier to drift into frustration, doubt, and that overthinking. Connections create stability. Another important part is learning how to release what you cannot control. This is one of the hardest things for all of us to do, even myself. When something matters to you, you want to manage it, you want to influence it. But there are parts of the process that's not for you to control. When you hold on to those things tightly, it creates tension. When you release them, it creates space for peace. That does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop trying to control what is not yours to control. There's also another level of confidence that begins to build when you stay consistent in the waiting season. When you continue to show up, continue to grow, continue to trust, you begin to see what you're capable of moving forward even without those immediate results. That builds resilience. It helps to approach future challenges with different mindset. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, you got to feel prepared. Waiting becomes less about delay and more about development. Another important takeaway as peace grows over time, it's not something that happens instantly. It is something that develops as you practice trust, consistency, and awareness. There will be still movements when you feel stretched. Again, movements when you feel uncertain. Moments when you feel that things should be moving faster. But those moments are not defined by direction. What defines your direction is how you respond to them. Do not allow them to pull you off track. You got to stay grounded. That choice matters. As you move forward, keep things simple. Stay consistent. Stay aware. Stay grounded in the truth. You do not need to overcomplicate this. When you do that, waiting begins to feel differently. You no longer feel like wasted time. It begins to feel like preparation. And when you see it that way, peace becomes easier to maintain. As we wrap things up, let's go ahead and close this out in prayer. Father, thank you for your perfect timing and your patience. You continue to build with us. Thank you for reminding us that even when we cannot see what is happening, you're still working behind the scenes. Help us trust you more deeply in seasons where things may feel delayed or unclear. Give us peace that's not tied to our circumstances, but rooted in your truth. Strengthen our hearts when we feel discouraged and help us remain steady when we are tempted to rush ahead of your plan. Guide our thoughts, our decisions, and our actions so we stay aligned with your purpose. Teach us to release what we cannot control and focus on what you are developing for us. Help us grow in patience, in faith, and confidence as we continue to move forward. Thank you for your presence, your guidance, and your promises that never fail. In Jesus' name, amen. So thanks again for coming back to Unshakable Promises. I look forward to our next episode. God bless you all.